Her hair unkempt about her neck down flaring. Ovid Metamorphosis, translation Arthur Golding, 1567. This is the quote that Mr. Kidder Smith, Dr. Kidder Smith, opens the lovely book Lipo Unkempt with. Kidder is joining us today as Michelle. And I thought this was a great quote for many reasons, but we miss out on having the original of Ovid in English, but we have the benefit of having Arthur Golding in English. And we miss out on Lipo in English, but we have the benefit of Kidder's wonderful book, Lipo Unkempt.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's really quite an accomplishment. And I worked with you and the other author, Mike Jai, a little bit, but as an editor, like at least seeing, or really an alpha reader, like an early reader, um, I think I was bearing too much of the weight of like feeling funny publishing things like this. And as a reader, it's all the pressure is away from me. And there's just the joy of what you're putting on the paper here.
Great. Thank you.
It also seems like, I don't know if it's having more context of what Chinese poetry is, um, but the things that I thought were outlandish before make so much more sense now in the book. Like the
Was
playfulness of the
that was our job. That was our job precisely, uh, because outlandishness is a reaction of dissociation. And to prevent that from happening, we had to do certain things, mostly tell stories
mm,
uh, that I'll say normalize it, uh, but in a non-trivial way.
in a non-trivial way.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's laden with stories, but it's not heavy with stories. I mean, it looks like it's going to be an intimidating read. It's a thick book, um, but it's really an easy read for being a Chinese poetry history book.
Yeah.
And so the lightness of it. I mean, our friend B Love was like, "This is the greatest book on Chinese poetry I've ever read," because he'd been so weighed down by a certain language of these things, and so it seems like you're offering a curative to that.
It's,
But it also seems like maybe it stands alone for readers who wouldn't be familiar with Chinese poetry and the history of China.
oh, yeah. Yeah. We tried to be so many different things. And so the book changes from paragraph to paragraph, and as you have seen. You
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's been very rewarding getting to look at it again after some time.
know.
Um, but I guess I'd want to talk a little bit about, I don't know what poet it was originally said of, but I love this line, a great writer, but a terrible influence. Um, and one could imagine that Lipo could be that. So there's a certain delicacy has to be taken.
Well, in fact, the Chinese critical tradition says exactly that. Do not try to copy Li Bo.
So how did you do that?
I just completely entered the circumstance.
That it makes sense because Lipo completely enters the circumstance.
There we go.
And
Peas,
so
peas in a pod.
peas in a pod. Yeah. So when Jack Kirby finished Fantastic Four, the next people were jumping on, and they said they were going to continue Fantastic Four in the Kirby tradition. And King Kirby said the kid doesn't get it. The Kirby tradition is to start another comic.
Mm. Mm.
So So could you give us just the intro? Who is this Lipo? Um, and maybe this is an additional question, but I'm curious because I thought of Lipo as being this banished immortal poet, um, sort of untouchable, classical, phenomenal Chinese poet, but I didn't realize how wed his story is with the Taoist tradition.
Mm,
So those might be two questions. I'm not sure.
yeah, so first is something very simple. He lived in the middle of the Tang Dynasty, which is roughly 600 to 900, uh, at a period in which Chinese poetry as we know it was finally coming together, melding various traditions. And poetry turned from being a kind of polite exchange between gentlemen, actually not so different from a Hallmark greeting card, uh, to something much more intimate and powerful. So he is part of that. He's not the only one, obviously, but he's a part of that transformation. Um,
And you mentioned that part of this was the influences of the South as well as the North. There was this Southern tradition that was more of a folksy sort.
yeah, I think I don't want to say too much about that because it would take us into literary history fairly far before it made much sense. But yes, you're right. It's the we could say the northern and southern traditions meeting.
Yeah. And Lipo, there are references in your book which quotes many sources, not just the writings of Lipo, um but to his ties to a Taoist tradition as well as a literary tradition.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, I'll say two things, sort of a big yes and a big no. Uh,
Mhm.
the big yes is you're quite right in discerning the affinity between his mind and activities and those recorded in the Taoist traditions. And uh, it would take, I think, a long time for me to say much more about what those traditions are here. You can open the book almost anywhere and find out more of those textures.
Yeah.
That's the yes part. The no part is that he doesn't fit in anywhere. So uh, sure, he's more Taoist than, say, Marxist, uh,
Mhm.
but that only gets us a little bit started and doesn't necessarily carry us a very long distance into him.
So it seems like he's clear that I mean, I was surprised that he was so clear about lines saying that he sought the Tao in places or
Yeah,
that he received the Tao at times.
totally.
Um, but what I think, if I understand what you're suggesting, is that that isn't a complete lens to understand his writing.
Good. And I would say Tao is a word that doesn't belong just to Taoism. The Confucians had their own Tao. The so and so people had their own. That just means a way, a tradition, a path. Uh,
And you have a great line in here. Lao Tzu, his fabled writing, the Tao Te Ching, Canon of the Virtues of Tao, its lead sentence is devilishly hard to translate since it's all pun. Tao means a road, a way, to speak, to lead. Tao that can be Taoed is not a long lasting Tao. Names that can be named are not long lasting names. And you
yeah,
also mentioned that there's no word in the Chinese for eternity. So
correct.
long lasting is the most you can get.
Yeah, that's right. That's very cool. I'll drink to that too.
What's in your cup today?
Dr. Loom, magic herbs.
You know, I celebrate 8 years sober today.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, so I couldn't think of a better thing to do than to meet with you and talk about Li Po.
And wine.
Yeah, let's talk about wine.
Great. Congratulations, kid.
Thank you.
Uh,
I shared with a bunch of alcoholics one time that I was studying Lipo at you, and I was worried they'd be like, yada yada, and they were all like, "Oh, that's awesome! You're studying poetry."
Uh,
We're a very supportive group of drunks. So yeah, let's talk about wine. I mean, Lipo's famous death was chasing the water moon,
yeah,
which would be the moon's reflection in water,
yeah,
um, drunkenly falling over the side of the boat.
yeah. And what's wonderful about that, and this is so representative of all this material, uh, is that that story doesn't emerge until maybe 200 years after his death.
Mm. A lot of what you're doing in this book is things happen so long after they occurred, and then I thought it was funny because I'm Kid, you're Kidder today,
Yeah,
Michelle. So when we'd meet people, they'd often say, "Who's Kiddest?"
yes.
The Kiddest would be Lao Tzu, because you explain in this book that one of his names would mean the old baby. Oh,
Uh-huh.
oh. So yeah, you were saying the story didn't emerge till 200 years after his death.
Yeah, yeah.
And so many things are created in retrospect, and then I guess that's something, maybe the marriage between uh Chinese poetry and history and Chinese histories is important there, because you would think that all these stories and anecdotes would take away from a book of poetry, but they're really, like, without them you're just not really getting it.
Good, good. I'll say two things. I would object to your word in retrospect
Mm,
because that assumes a linear time,
mm.
and we're working with a different kind of reality here.
And that's not the Chinese reality. That's the Lipo reality.
Uh, Something like that. Yes, yes, yes.
What 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 I mean is, I've found this in some of the things that I assumed were like the standard of Chinese culture. Um, Forgets that some of the people who created the standard were really radicals and still might be in many ways today.
Yes. And so the other part of what you said was so beautiful about poetry and history.
Mm,
Uh, and maybe I can give another similar pair. Poetry and history is good. Uh, I don't know, this is kind of lame, but it's like personal and environmental or self and other. Something.
mm,
So when we talk poetry history, we're talking about something very fundamental, not just two academic disciplines,
mm.
but we're talking about two aspects of experience that interact in very powerful ways, and that many of my colleagues have kept separate for various reasons, and which I've insisted on joining together here.
Yeah. So my mind goes to an analogy that I'm going to see if I get totally lost with. Um, it's Bazin, the film critic Andre Bazin. He talked about canned theater. So you take a play and then you put it in a film. And he said the problem that some of these would do is they would try to make it clear that this was a film. So they'd put a scene in the park, but the scene had no need to be in a park. So instead of making it seem more like a film, it seemed
Yeah,
more like an awkward staging of a film.
yes, yes, yes.
Um, and my mind is failing to understand if this is the same thing or it's opposite, because what you're talking about is like the attempt to remove it from to separate these two was, you feel failing in a sense.
Yeah,
in my experience, part of that failure is just because I just don't know how to care about a poem about the precious consort. Um,
Well,
except for now, and now I like am in love with the precious consort
yes, yes, yes,
after I read your chapter on her. What?
yes, 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 yes.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so and the precious consort was the consort to the bright emperor. Is that also the yellow emperor?
Well, the Bright Emperor is the name that we give to the ruling emperor under Libo's time, and the
Mm.
Yellow Emperor is the name that the Taoists give to some long, long, long pre something or other.
Ah, I see. I wasn't sure if that was just the same thing translated differently.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so you end up falling in love with sort of the characters. It's actually you'd probably tolerate this. It's almost like the monkeys because they tried to put the monkeys on TV and they were the viewings were just terrible and they couldn't understand why because they thought this was hilarious. And then they showed reels like of the monkeys just like backstage, like they under like who they
Yeah,
were.
yeah, yeah,
And then they did, they became the monkeys
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's very good.
because so much of it is reference to all these places and times. And maybe that's part of the hallmark card nature of these things that the poems weren't meant to be self-contained.
Yes, and completely private, just between, sort of like uh, Frank O'Hara, personalist poetry. You know, I'm referring to. He decided that poems should only be written from one person to another person.
Mm, mm. So this is very interesting because it's the poetry is of Lipo is very holographic.
Yes,
It contains the whole universe,
yes.
but it's concentrated in this direct communication.
Mhm. Also, yes.
You go from there. It's a beautiful book.
I'll,
It's
I'll just say,
divided in yeah, go on.
I'll just say one more thing about the book. We don't need to talk about it, but anyone who's interested in the book should know. Uh, there's a joke concealed on just about every page. You have to dig it out, and that there are 700 endnotes. And I often use the endnotes to undercut what has been established in the main text. So just a kind of uh, uh, warning, you could say, or announcement of
Mm,
how the book works. It,
mm.
it tries to do what it says.
What do you mean?
Hmm? Yeah.
What do you mean?
What do I mean? Well, certain texts are kind of descriptive, uh, and so their diction is uh, somewhat formal. Other texts, like a love song, actually uh, make love while they sing it.
Mm, mm.
And so this book is more like that. So the way it's written uh, uh, should be consistent with what it's. I'm sorry if I say it. What it's trying to say, so to speak.
Yeah, so I have a question for you there, um, which comes from uh which comes from the elements of style. And in the elements of style, it suggests that its suggestions are pretty harsh, but um, that one should not adopt a breezy air. And I talked on an earlier episode of this show with my friend Anne, because she has a pretty breezy air in her writing. And I think that what makes it work is that it's not adopted.
Yeah, yeah. Strunk could only imagine that being adopted because he was not a breezy person. So
Mm,
it would all seem fake to him.
mm. So you might say that other people should not adopt a stauncher and personal heir.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So and then in China, um, this the breezy quality of Li Bo was more or less unheard of, right?
Correct.
As you had Zhuangzi writing like that long time before that.
Yes. Yes. And who was reading Zhuangzi? You know,
Who was, by the way?
it's a little hard to know. It's a wonderful question, and doesn't seem to. I mean, we could
You
we
know,
could write the public history of China without ever mentioning him.
wow. And then it also seems like in both cases they because so Lipo was literally considered a banished immortal.
Uh,
Well, you could argue what literal means in the case of a banished immortal, um, but there's a certain quality of they're kind of the exception that proves the rule.
yeah, yeah, something like that. Let me see if I might have something more to say. I'm not sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know. It's very tricky talking about the rules
Yeah.
because uh, someone else might be, well, I mean, basically everyone is as peculiar as Li Ba, but
Mm.
we don't know it. Uh, so,
Yeah, yeah. So Lipo is phenomenal in his in the in how unabashed he is
uh-huh, yeah,
about that.
yes.
I wanted to give a sampling here, but I'm trying to find a poem um of the Precious Consort because all I care about is Precious Consort. Um, but let's look at Face to Face with Wine because I want to talk about wine.
Hey,
Um, Immortal red pine nested in Goldflower Mountain, divine Anki swam in fairy sea. These immortals of old took wing, and where are they now? This floating life flows quick as lightning, transforming suddenly to light. Heaven and earth never wither, never fall away, but our beauty moves off, leaving us behind. Face to face with this wine, unwilling to drink, flush of feeling. Whom do I await? Yeah, it's hard to say anything after that, but you got to give us something because the question of what is wine to Lipo. I mean, you mentioned in the book somewhere that he has plenty of longing, but no separation.
yeah, yeah, that's very important.
Yeah, because if you're like me, um, you can kind of understand this metaphor of wine leading you to illumination, but I understand it a little too well. And for Lipo, we had a friend who said cigarettes were the thing he can want and have. His
Uh,
wanting doesn't go away when he has it,
uh-huh.
and the having doesn't take away the want. Like he can do both, you know. Coffee is the thing I can want and have. Alcohol is not a thing I could want and have.
Uh,
But for Lipo, it seems to be.
apparently. Uh,
Tao is hidden, can't be seen. Its divine writing stored in grotto heavens. For 40,000 eons, my teacher transmitted it from one generation to another. He leaves behind a green bamboo staff, singing as he goes, walking on purple clouds. The mind at parting knows not near or far, held forever in the city of jade.
Yeah.
The translations are very gentle for a book that quotes Men in Black and Billie Holiday and Semi Tough.
Plenty tough.
Semi Tough. Um, Semi Tough is referenced in this book because there's a long standing question of who's China's greatest poet, Li Po or Du Fu. Um, and Kidder Smith quotes the movie Semi Tough um, and says that Jenny Wood is not a 10. Jenny Wood is a 9. Jenny Wood and her sister Patty are 10. Something about the two of them together.
You have the quote, whole quote is there's two football players talking. One
Yeah.
says, there are no tens, talking about women. There are no tens. The other guy was, Jenny Wood is a 10. He says, no, Jenny Wood is a 9. Jenny Wood and his sister Maria together are a 10. So Li Bo and Du Fu together are China's greatest poet.
Yeah. 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 Du Fu is Lipo makes fun of Du Fu because he says like, oh, you're looking like you haven't slept and your hair is all disheveled and you're
Uh,
probably working on another poem.
mm,
Um, because there's this sense of effortlessness in Lipo's writing.
mm,
And there's a sense of turmoil in Du Fu. But Du Fu is also writing a lot about turmoil and being disheartened and
oh,
being away from the the city of Chanang,
oh,
which
oh,
is the sort of a celestial ideal
mm,
place, although on Earth.
oh,
It's actually interesting because so much of what you're writing about is that there's a false dichotomy between heaven and earth and between the eminent and the transcendent,
yes,
which Lipo completely understands.
yes,
And Dufu could go as far as the city of Chennai.
yes, 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 yes. Um, um, I'm getting a little tired. We don't have to stop right now, but maybe 5, 10 minutes more, if that's all
Yeah,
right.
we can call it. I'd love to talk to you about Dogen sometime soon, but I'm gonna have to read some Dogen.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I have a has looking at Lipo's writing, I just want to ask if it's changed how have you been able to be influenced by his breezy air without adopting it? And you mentioned that you have to jump in to the circumstance rather than pull yourself back to 1700s China.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So ask me the question again.
Yeah, how have you been able to take Lipo as an influence without it being artificial?
Every
How's
everything is
reading working on
artificial.
it?
Everything
Uh,
is artificial.
mm, mm.
No, that's fine, not a problem.
All right, well, there's that.
Wonderful to talk to you, and congratulations again.
It's so good to see you, Michelle.
Yeah.
What am I being? Oh, I have 8 years.
8 years. What?
8 years on coffee.
Yeah, yeah, 8 years. There you go.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really
Thank you
appreciate
for joining us, Kidder.
it. We had a wonderful time. Yeah.
I'll talk to you later.